Professor Phil Martin. He works at UC Davis in he's the chair of the Comparative Immigration and Integration Program, editor of Migration News and the Rural Migration News, and he works on agriculture and resource economics, and he recently came back from the Caucasus. Is that right?
Or Georgia, yeah.
Georgia. Studying immigration in Georgia, too, apparently, as in the country, not the state. So he's got a very global perspective on immigration and what it means. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you all for being here after lunch. What we're going to do now is, Frank talked about one topic in quite a bit of depth. We're going to sort of go a little higher and take a bit of an overview. I'm not sure what you've already had. And since I've been teaching a few years, I always say in this class we're going to cover 3 points so that if you get it at the beginning, it might get reinforced at the end. The first thing is, does anybody know how many members United Farm Workers has today?
5,000.
They reported 3,186 to the Department of Labor last year. Okay, so they have relative. Do anybody know how many farm workers we have in California?
Hundreds of thousands. 400,000 from the same piece that I have, the 5,000.
Okay, the average is 400,000. Okay, the total number is 800,000. Why is there a 2-to-1 gap? Think of a McDonald's. To run a McDonald's, you need about 20 people, perhaps, let's say. Actually, they hire about 40 people in the course of a year. The turnover is called 100%. Now, agriculture is a little different because 400,000 is the average. But in the peak, in September, the total employment is around 500,000. And in January, in the trough, it's about 300,000. So clearly, you need at least 500,000. And then, of course, a lot of people start and they quit, etc. So in agriculture and generally, 400,000 is what we call year-round average employment. And you normally double that number to get the total number of workers. That's also true of the UFW, which means that if they count 3,200 members, that doesn't mean it's 3,200 people employed 12 months a year. Some of those people are employed 12 months a year, the guys who pick mushrooms and stuff. Some of them are employed for 3 or 4 months. Okay, so the UFW is a relatively small union. The Teamsters have more members in agriculture than does the UFW. The Teamsters still have a few contracts in Salinas. Something called the United Food and Commercial Workers Union also has quite a few members. They're very strong in dairies, etc. So we actually have about 10 unions in California agriculture. The UFW is by far the best known, but it doesn't necessarily have the most contracts or the most members. So throughout history, we've had a lot of unions, and there's really no continuity between a union in the past and a union today. Okay, that's the first point. And there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to build a strong union in agriculture. One of the reasons, perhaps, you've already heard is the average, school teachers are actually the most loyal to an occupation, school teachers and nurses, of any occupation in the U.S. You start in that occupation, you're likely to stay in it for your entire working life. That's not true of farm work. Especially seasonal farm work, it's a job, it's not a career. The average tenure, as we call it in agriculture, in seasonal agriculture, is about 10 years. So think of a farmer, 5th generation farmer. Farm worker, not 5th generation. Usually, you get out as soon as you can. The problem with building a strong union is the most able guys are the people who get out the quickest. And that makes it hard to build a strong union. So the first point is, unions have never been much of a factor in agriculture. They aren't today, and there's a lot of reasons for it, not just grower opposition, all kinds of things. But one very fundamental thing is people want to get out of agriculture. Their children educated in the U.S. want to avoid getting into agriculture. And so therefore, new workers come from abroad, and that's not new. The second is that farm workers do about 60% of the work in U.S. agriculture. Big change. I must admit I was surprised a couple of years ago when I looked at this, because we usually think of farmers and their family members as doing most of the work, but today actually it's a little over half is done by hired workers. And you know, we always talk about agriculture being the closest to an apartheid industry in the U.S. The average farmer is 58, 96% of them are white, and they're U.S. born and U.S. citizen. Okay? The average farm worker is 28. Mostly they're born in Mexico, and they're Hispanic, obviously. And so the average age of U.S. workers, by the way, is 41. So farm workers are young and Hispanic. Farmers are old and white. And they're different than the average U.S. worker. Now, the question is, what's going to happen? Frank talked a lot about the skills involved in agriculture. The U.S. Department of Labor considers farm work an unskilled occupation. And so in other words, if I'm a farmer and I want to bring in legal guest workers, I'm not allowed to put an experience requirement in there. I'm also not allowed to say I want to pick a Mexican worker because he or she is going to work harder than a U.S. worker. I'm not allowed to do that. Courts have said you cannot put experience requirements in. You cannot pick Mexican workers as guest workers simply because they're more productive. I mean, that's you can argue about it, but that's basically what the court says. What's going to happen in the future? What's going to happen is exactly what has been happening. In 1790, at the first census, 95% of Americans worked in agriculture. 95%. Today, it's about 1.5%. The future of agriculture is fewer people producing more food. There's a simple rule of thumb. If you go to any country and you say, what share of your labor force is in agriculture? If they tell you it's over 50%, that's a poor country. There's no exceptions in the world. Georgia has 53% of its people in agriculture. Bangladesh has 70%. So any country where over half the people are employed in agriculture is a poor country. Absolutely no exceptions to that rule. If you go to a country and you say, and less than 5% of the people are in agriculture, that's a rich country. Absolutely no exceptions to that rule. We're at about 1.5%, as I said. New Zealand is the highest among the rich countries. It's at about 4% of its people employed in agriculture. The general rule is economic development means fewer people employed in agriculture. How do we still produce much more food than we did in 1790? We have a lot of mechanization. We substitute capital for labor, machines, as we get richer. The big three options for dealing with the future of labor-intensive agriculture are we'll do more mechanization. It's already true that almost all wine grapes in California are picked by machine. Mechanization is sprayed. Raisins now, half of them are picked by machine. So that's been the traditional thing. We will get new workers from abroad. People don't grow up in the U.S. to be farm workers, so we will get more from abroad. And we'll import more. All bananas that you eat are imported, all of them. And almost all fresh asparagus, about 90%, is imported from Peru and Mexico. So that's likely to continue. You all know the biggest single producer of fruits and vegetables in the world is China, right? China already produces most of the processed strawberries. They will eventually be producing lots of strawberries and shipping them this way, as opposed to us now shipping them to Japan. And then the third, so first was union, second was farm labor, third is migration. Basically, if the status quo continues, and that's the most likely outcome of policy, we'll wind up arguing about where the farm workers of tomorrow come from. Anybody know the fastest growth in the hired farm workforce in the western states is from a country that most of you wouldn't think about? Not the total number. By far the largest number of hired workers were born in Mexico. But where is the fastest growth? Anybody have an idea?
Honduras?
It's Thailand. So you're in the right area. Now here's the big question. Some of you may have been to Thailand. And this is what I have to always think about with Frank. Where are they working? They're picking apples in Washington. Now, if you've ever been to Thailand, it's a fairly hot country. They don't have a lot of apples, right? But they're pretty good apple pickers. And if you talk to the employers, they say attitude is much more important than skill. What does attitude mean? The ability to stand out there and work. and accept the wages that are paid, okay? So Mexico does not produce a lot of the commodities in which Mexicans work in the United States. It is important that people get hired in networks, they work in crews, they get trained in crews, but be careful about this idea that, this has always been a big argument about, it is a skilled job, but there's a reason why we don't allow skill requirements when you go to hire guest workers. It is something that if you are willing to work hard, most people can do it. So I'm not sure what you've heard already, but I was supposed to cover these 3 topics: unions, farm labor, and migration. You all know what unions are. And unions have 4 tools that they use. They use strikes, and if you strike, what you're trying to do is reduce the supply of the good. The auto workers go on strike, you can't produce cars. The second thing unions do is you try to reduce the supply of labor. Most unions are anti-immigrant, have historically been. UFW contracts always have anti-mechanization clauses in them. They say you can't mechanize during the life of this contract. The most effective union in the US isn't called a union, it's the American Medical Association. How does it work? It controls the number of doctors who can be trained. It's a tremendous way to boost the average salaries of doctors. Third, you can do political activities, which unions do a lot of, so do employers. And finally, you can do consumer boycotts, reduce the demand for a good. Now, unlike what Frank said, the 1979 strike of the UFW is normally looked at as a huge failure for the UFW. It was a Pyrrhic victory. They asked for a 40% wage increase, and they got it. So in that sense, they won. But then what happened? All those companies went out of business. And they sued, and they went to court, and they won once. But in the end, a judge threw it all out. It was a huge, it took out of business big conglomerates that were vulnerable to a boycott. Because after all, where did they get the breakthrough? It was with the Chiquita Brands farming subsidiary. And it went out of business because you don't have to stay in business. And so consumer boycott, we normally teach students that if you're producing a perishable commodity with an inelastic supply, the last thing you want to do is call a strike. So what does that mean? The demand for lettuce is inelastic. If you go to the store and they're having a sale on lettuce, and now it's 50 cents instead of $1, you're not going to buy 100 heads of lettuce. I mean, you can't eat that much lettuce. The average American eats 22 heads of lettuce a year. If it were cheaper, you might eat a little more lettuce. But there's no way you're going to just get rid of everything else and eat nothing but lettuce. And so, therefore, the demand for most fruits and vegetables is what we call inelastic. It's true you buy a little more when the price is lower, but you don't buy a lot more. And if you are calling a strike to reduce the supply of an inelastic product, what happens? Well, you don't produce as much, and the price goes up. What happened in the 1979 lettuce strike? The price tripled. And not everybody, they actually produced a lot of lettuce. They produced about 2/3. The strike really shut down some people, but not everybody. Those who kept producing were getting huge windfall profits. Okay? And so we normally look at, and what did the growers do right after the strike ended? They set up a strike insurance fund. We don't know which company we're going to target. So we're all going to pay premiums, and then if they hit my farm, okay, I can't produce anything, but I'll still get money because from the premiums everybody else paid. So we normally say the smarter economic way to put pressure in a market where demand is inelastic is you boycott. And if you boycott now, you're reducing the demand, so you don't buy table grapes. Remember, only 12% of Americans did not buy table grapes. That means 88% of Americans did buy table grapes. And remember, Nixon, I think Nixon was president, he bought table grapes for the troops in Vietnam, all sorts of stupid things. But the punchline was, if you have an inelastic demand, that is, people don't buy any more or less at high prices, then you want to do a boycott. You want to get that 5 or 10% liberals, whatever you want to call them, to stop buying, and the price will actually sink a lot. That's what happened to table grapes. We had 12% who did not buy, but that reduced the price. And now look at the trick. With boycotts, I mean, in this sense, I think Caesar was economically correct. With boycotts, the farmer still has to pick. in order to get the lower price, right? So the price of my grapes has gone down. If I don't pick them, I don't get anything. So I still have to pick. So the workers get hired and get their wages to, and we've got the students and the church people out there doing the boycott, which is how it worked. And it's a beautiful way. You don't need strike benefits because the union didn't have any strike benefits to speak of. And so normally we teach that, remember, the key is what's the nature of the demand for the product. If it's an inelastic product, then you always want to boycott and not strike. So in that sense, it was what Caesar did turned out to be the correct strategy. He didn't take economics, but he did feel his way to the best strategy. You all know that it's not just farm worker unions that don't have many members. The high water mark of unions in this country was the 1950s. 1 out of 3 people in the private sector was a union member. Today, we're down to about 1 out of 12 people, and as you know, there are more union members in the public sector than in the private sector, right? It happened a few years ago, and it doesn't look like it's going to change. So, remember, most union members are in the public sector, mostly working for local governments, and we have about only 7% of private sector workers who are unionized. In agriculture, we probably have about 10,000 union members among 800,000 workers. That's a relatively small percentage. But unions actually do something for workers. The average, what we call wage premium, if you take a person who has the same level of education, age, etc., and one's represented by a union and one's not, the wage premium is a little over 20%. So there is a reason to join, to be in a union. You'll generally speaking get higher wages, and you'll typically get a lot more in benefits. We always point out to students, employers usually don't want unions. But getting rid of unions doesn't mean you necessarily have a free hand. So as unions have gone down, what's gone up? In law schools now, they don't teach union labor relations law anymore, but they teach anti-discrimination law. We've enormously expanded. And if you pick up any of the newsletters from labor law firms, there's not much about collective bargaining and strikes. Strikes have, by and large, almost disappeared. There is reams and reams of cases on people complaining about discrimination, whether it's for age, race, sex, all the reasons, and that's mostly what labor law is all about now. The second thing to keep in mind is that even if you don't have unions, there's a lot of regulation of occupations. Lots of occupations, as you well know, you need a license or you need a certificate. So we probably have about 1/3 of the labor force that is regulated in some fashion, even if it's not subject to any kind of collective bargaining. So now on to California farm worker unions. The way we teach this usually, and when we do, if we still do anymore, is that unions in agriculture in California were always a clash of extremes. Mainstream unions basically did not bother trying to organize farm workers. I think it was George Meany who said only idiots would go out and try to organize seasonal farm workers. He used more colorful language because he said basically they have low wages, they get out of agriculture, you'll never form a stable union. So who organized farm workers? Well, traditionally it was very radical organizers. The Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, were the first one, the communists in the 1930s. And what you can sort of see what the setup is here. You've got both the IWW, the so-called Wobblies, and the Cannery and Agricultural Industrial Workers Union, they didn't believe in contracts. I mean, the whole point was to get rid of employers, not to sign contracts with them. So they were the most radical of all the unions we had, and they were up against farm employers. And up against farm employers in rural counties where the workers were migrants, the union leaders were outsiders, and the employers were linked into the local law enforcement. So you can imagine what happened. In every case, there was violence, strikes and violence, and the union leaders lost. They got jailed, they got prosecuted, and the story we always tell is, the first big labor strike in California agriculture was in 1913 up in Wheatland in Yuba County, and they were picking hops, the hops you used to do beer, and this is the way we used to do things in this state. you hand billed. So they put out little handbills and they offered $1 a hundredweight to harvest hops. Now the normal rate was 85 cents, so this was a premium price. A whole lot of people came, right? There was no internet or anything. And when they got there, too many people came, so they said, what the hell, I'm going to cut the wage. So he cut the wage. Now people used to spend, I mean, people would often be down to their last pennies. They would get there, and now all of a sudden, they're not going to make as much money as they thought. Well, they went on strike. They said, you've got to meet the promise that you made. That's why we came here. And Durst said, there's communists out here. The IWW took over, and the strike, they wrote up demands. A lot of people were illiterate. The sheriff came out, actually the district attorney, the sheriff, a few law enforcement people got killed, a few strikers got killed, and that's actually why they built Folsom Prison. The first inmates in Folsom Prison were the IWW leaders, because the whole idea was, if you are an outsider coming in against local law enforcement and there's violence, you're going to be blamed. There was a government report after, and that's the whole point of this is, the government report said, by the way, you know, we don't want communists here, we don't want radicals here, but they had a point. I mean, the guy promised a wage and he cut it, and he shouldn't have done it. And if we want to avoid trouble like this in the future, we've got to get employers more honest. But there was no law passed like that. The same thing happened in the 1930s. Wages were cut for the Depression, and remember the New Deal started in 1932, so farm prices went way up in 1933. And the issue was, how do you raise wages with farmers doing better? Because most farmers did not want to raise wages. And these guys, the CAIWU, was young people out of New York, or seemingly young people coming out. And they, you remember, the farm workers needed somebody to help write up their demands. And they were pretty successful. They got wages raised. But remember, they didn't sign contracts. And that success really scared the farmers. They passed this. Associated Farmers was an organization that was started. They got pretty much every county in the San Joaquin Valley, and probably Monterey as well. That's when we had these vagrancy laws. If you were, what was it? If you were caught with less than $5, then you were a vagrant, and then you would be automatically sentenced to 30 days, and you'd be lent out to the local farmers to work off, because people couldn't pay their fines. Obviously, they didn't have $5. They couldn't pay $20 fine. And so most of those laws were declared unconstitutional, but the net effect was, once again, to get rid of the union leaders, and the union died. So, you know, those are examples of radical unions. It is true that mainstream unions try to organize California farm workers, and they usually use what we call a march inland strategy. So what's march inland? You start from where you have power and you march back to the fields where you don't have any power. And so you start at the ports or the canneries and you go into the fields. It failed pretty much everywhere except in Hawaii. The Hawaii farm workers have by far the highest wages in U.S. agriculture, and part of the reason was that the longshoremen's union said, we won't load the pineapples if you don't pay the wages, and so they paid the wages. And so the march inland really didn't work well. We also tried top-down organizing. Top-down organizing means it's a lot of work to go out and talk to individual workers because many of them are conservative, etc. So top-down means it's a lot more efficient to take a labor contractor who's got a crew of 50 and say, let's sign them up. And that's what the AFL and CIO unions did in the 1950s. They had organizers that almost got paid piece rate, how many people you sign up. Well, it's a lot more efficient to sign up a couple hundred at one time. And so the workers who were signed up saw this deduction from their pay for union dues. But of course, they hadn't voted or anything like that. And so that really was not a terribly popular strategy, especially because unions were anti-minority, anti-immigrant, and all that sort of stuff. So efforts to organize farm workers up until the 1960s basically failed. And then you heard the story, you know, remember the Filipinos actually called the strike. And anybody, I don't know, Frank, somebody probably told you why they called the strike. But the basic punchline was that braceros had to be paid $1.40 an hour. In every guest worker program, we have something called an adverse effect wage rate. It's an artificial minimum wage, which is set usually higher than the minimum wage, and it's set to avoid depressing wages. So the adverse effect wage rate in California agriculture today is $10.50 an hour. But of course, our minimum wage is $8 an hour. And we set that higher wage to avoid having the presence of the foreigners depress. So the adverse effect wage rate in 1964 was $1.40 an hour. And now that the Bracero program was over in 1965, the growers cut the wage to $1.25. And the Filipinos said, no, we want $1.40. So that's what the strike was all about. It was cutting the wage, because under the Bracero program, if you paid Braceros $1.40, you were supposed to pay Americans $1.40. And so now the wages were going, in that case, the Bracero program held the wages of those workers up a little higher. And that's what the whole strike was about. People say in retrospect the growers invited the strike because they cut the wage. And the real genius was, the normal thing was you go and strike, and as Frank said, when the strike is over, the season's over, you move on to the next thing. And what Chavez did was he kept the pressure on the company during the off-season. Now you have to understand that the big company was Schenley. Schenley is now out of business, but it's a liquor company. And it was headquartered in Connecticut. And the story is that when they went in to see, after Chavez was getting publicity and stuff, and remember this was a time when the Kennedy family took an enormous interest, and they went to Bakersfield, somewhere in Kern County, and they did a Senate hearing. And during the Senate hearing, the sheriff, hard to believe now, the sheriff actually said that he arrests people before they commit a crime because he knows they're going to commit a crime. And so Kennedy, of course, got the chance to pull out the US Constitution and say, by the way, you can't do that. You can't pre-arrest people before they have committed a crime. That's the way they were arresting UFW people. So they got a lot of publicity, and they eventually went to Schenley, and supposedly the CEO of Schenley didn't even know he had a table grape farm. And the basic idea was that they were losing business. As you probably know, a third of all liquor is sold in the last 2 months of the year. So you had all these nuns in front of liquor stores saying, don't buy Schenley liquor. And he said, give them whatever they want, because we're taking a huge hit over here on 90% or 98% of our sales, all to defend ourselves with the good table grape growers. So Schenley caved. And instead of getting to $1.40, they got to $1.75. So 40% is a wage increase that sticks a lot in the UFW. It was their first big one. It's what they tried in 1979. It's one that we use often to say what would happen if. So why did it succeed? Well, Chavez was a farmer. He was not one of these top-down outsiders like AFL and CAIWU had used. He was a good speaker. The big thing, of course, there were not braceros, and there were not really unauthorized foreigners in the 1960s. You heard about the green card commuter program. Keep in mind, the total amount of Mexican immigration in the 1960s, total, was a little over 600,000. The maximum estimate that anybody can come up with for green card commuters is 60,000. That's 1/10. Okay, so it was significant, but it wasn't dominant. Remember, we were bringing in 500,000 braceros a year. There really were. It was a time of relative labor shortage. And it was between, they call the period from 1965 till 1980, the golden era for farm workers. It was the only time, when you look at a century of statistics, in which the wages of farm workers went up faster than the average wages of all US workers. The only time in 100 years. And so we had no braceros. We had boycotts. They turned out to be economically correct for reasons I told you. And the Teamsters were out there. So for a lot of growers, the idea was somebody is going to represent my workers. Is it going to be the Teamsters, or is it going to be the UFW? And I'm going to have to pay union wages just to avoid having them choose which union they would do. So anytime you have competition between two unions, one wins, right? So you always want competition. That means people are interested in unions. So the UFW succeeded for lots of reasons. And then, this is what I wrote a book about. Why did it fail? Because now you've got Miriam Powell's book. Why did this big movement fail? Most books are a little bit the way Powell's book and Frank's book is. They're usually the first two of these four reasons. Chavez started out great, he went crazy. Or he didn't have local unions, etc. Or politics. You know, it started under Democrats and then came Republicans. That's what most books, because I should say, California passed the ALRA in 1975, and the expectation was that most workers would be organized. Okay, they're not. 3,200 for the UFW, 10,000 total. My book, basically, I'm an economist, so it makes sense, says it really, you know, all four factors are important, but if you had to pick what were the most important, the last two are probably more important than the first two. So what's farm structure? Farm structure is the idea that in the 1960s and 70s, companies with brand names actually hired farm workers. 7-Up had a lemon ranch down in Oxnard. There was a chain of stores that had an outlet in, it was AmFac was named Liberty House or something like that. It had a store in Union Square in San Francisco. And they had a mushroom farm. There were farmland. We had 1970s were inflationary, and farmland was a big thing for insurance companies. Farmland had a better return than the stock market in the 1970s. So Tenneco, Shell, all these big oil companies owned farmland. They were vulnerable to boycotts. In the 1986 was a huge crisis in agriculture. They almost all sold. They're almost all out of business. And today, the brand name basically hires almost no workers. So Dole has lots of layers between it and farm workers. Fresh Express, Dole and Fresh Express are about 2/3 of the bag salad market. By and large, they don't hire workers directly. There's about 3 layers between them and farm workers. And therefore, it's much more difficult. You could still operate a boycott, but it's much harder to operate a boycott today than it would have been. And then, of course, the other thing is rising. The official term, by the way, is unauthorized. The government term for illegal, undocumented is unauthorized. Most of these, many of you know undocumented workers, but if you ever actually go out to Raisin Grapes, everybody's got documents. The question is, they're not documents issued by the U.S. government. So undocumented is not really correct. So unauthorized is the official term, and that made it much, much harder to do anything. Today, Arturo Rodriguez is the brother-in-law, or son-in-law, I should say, of Caesar. You know, I just pulled the numbers the other day. I already told you they're a little less than 3,200 members. They have 8 national vice presidents. I mean, okay, many of you are in a union, and this is what sort of surprises me. They've got 8 national vice presidents. They've got 60 employees, organizers, and staff. This is a huge amount of administration for 3,200 members. They get a little over $7 million a year. Last year they got a little over $7 million. What I didn't write, what is almost none of it comes from dues. It's almost all donations. Okay, so that's the biggest source of money for the UFW. And there's a whole lot of UFW. The UFW is a major owner of apartment homes, as you probably know, in both in the Central Valley and in San Antonio in Texas. They have a radio station. They have some of the biggest printing presses in California. For many years, they were the main printers of Democratic Party campaign literature. So it's a fairly, yeah, if you want, the LA Times did a series that was the basis of Powell's book. But there's a lot of UFW-affiliated firms, almost all run by relatives of Chavez in one way or another. So it's a fairly extensive thing. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that's the UFW today. Okay, that was unions. A little bit on Chavez. Now we're going to do farm labor, and then we're going to come back to migration. I already told you 60% of the work is done by hired workers today. That's a big switch from just 20 years ago. Keep in mind that agriculture is dispersed. The U.S. economy has about 8 million employers. And farmers are almost 10% of all employers in the U.S. But farm workers are only about 2% of all the workers in the U.S. Okay, so farmers as employers are much more important than farm workers as workers in terms of their relative strength. The big thing about agriculture is that everything is concentrated. So remember, we have 2.2 million farms, and half of them lose money year after year after year after year. What are they? They're hobby and part-time operations. I mean, if you have a horse, whatever a farm is, you normally sell $1,000 worth of farm goods a year. A 4-H project can be a farm. Okay? So most farms lose money. You're supposed to make money 2 years out of 5, but many times people go in, they lose money, they get out after, it depends how good their accountant is. The University of California, Davis, you know what our #1 donation is? It's horses. We have a ranch somewhere in Nevada that's got thousands, because the girl gets a horse, the girl discovers boys, the horse disappears, and they want to give it and get a tax write-off. We get thousands of horses every year. Those people could have been, depending on what their tax accountant told them, they could have been farmers for a few years if they managed to sell anything. So a farm, every time you read an average in agriculture, it's a totally meaningless number because it's averaging together big farms, like a dole, with people who lose money. So even though we have a lot of farm employers, about 10,000 of them probably account for most farm worker employment. The big thing used to be fruits, vegetables, horticultural specialties. That's FVH, so fruits and nuts, vegetables and melons, horticultural specialties like mushrooms, nursery flowers. And dairies are becoming much more important. The biggest dairy in the world, I guess, is down in the Boz Dairy down by Bakersfield, 26,000 cows. They are employing lots and lots of Mexican workers. I already told you the 2-to-1 ratio between average employment. So you take whatever average employment is and multiply by 2, and that's the number of unique workers. Who are the workers? Well, this is national data, but California is very much the same. They're Hispanic, and most of them are born in Mexico. They're not well educated. Okay, so most of them have not completed 10th grade. Most don't speak English, and basically the punchline is that if you're trying to compare a farm worker to an average U.S. worker, the average hourly earnings in the U.S. economy are $20 an hour. Okay? And the average person works 50 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, 2,000 hours. So $20 an hour, 2,000 hours, $40,000. Okay? That's actually roughly the average earnings of a full-time worker in the U.S. economy. Now, if you take a farm worker, the average is about $10 an hour. And a seasonal worker especially is only going to work about half the year. So if you go 1/2 times 1/2, you get 1/4, and that's why seasonal workers earn about $10,000 a year, not $40,000 a year. Okay? And so you're earning half as much, you're working half as much, and that's why many workers want to get out. They want to find more hours of work, not necessarily a higher wage, because you'll often hear farmers say, look how much people earn, cherry picking. Actually now, unlike the film, actually the average over in Lodi, Stockton this year is about 15 bucks an hour. And you can look at the pay stubs. Maybe I wouldn't have made it that much, but that's what cherry pickers are made. Up in Washington now, a lot of them are at 16, 17 an hour. Part of the reason is cherries and strawberries are huge success stories. It's rare that the production goes up and the prices go up. But in both cherries and strawberries, whatever, we all started eating them or something, the farmers are doing well. And the farmer will tell you, farmers get about $1.25 a pound for cherries, Washington cherries. It used to be they were paying 15 cents a pound. Now a lot of them are paying 20 cents a pound. At 20 cents a pound, a good picker can make 16 bucks an hour. But for the farmer, if his pay is going up, he doesn't care if he's paying a little bit more, if he has to pay a little bit more. So, but even at $15 an hour, the cherry season's pretty short, so I'm never going to get that many hours. And that lack of hours is what pushes many people out. This is the standard X diagram. Basically, in 1987-88, we legalized 1.1 million unauthorized farm workers. So we had IRCA legalization program. And the blue line is the IRCA people. They were about 1/3 of farm workers. You can see they got out of agriculture really quick. And the red line is illegal or unauthorized, and they've been about half of the farm workforce for the last 15 years. So roughly half of all workers employed in crops are unauthorized. So, you know, question is, agriculture is a screwed up industry, and why? It's really an industry of contrast. Many farmers, I mean, the joke we always say is, it's hard to find a farmer under 40. Farmers in the U.S., on average, even with those money-losing people, their incomes are higher than the average U.S. household. their wealth is enormously greater because they own land. And land, in case you didn't know, is very valuable. So the land is $20,000 an acre to buy land in Fresno that's got perennial crops on it. You go to Monterey, you can pay $40,000, $50,000. You go to Napa, you can pay $100,000 an acre. So a lot of farms in this state are huge. I mean, they're relatively big farms. So if I got 1,000 acres, it's worth $20,000 an acre. I'm sitting on $20 million of assets. That's a lot of money. And in many cases, the land is paid for. So that's free and clear. But it's a multi-generation business where children follow their parents. But for workers, it's a job. It's a job you want to get out of as soon as you can. The question is, why have we never treated hired workers like other occupations? There's a lot of reasons. I mean, political power and stuff. But one of the reasons is we had a president, Thomas Jefferson, and he did a lot of writing. And one of his writings was about how the U.S. was going to be different, you know, the exceptional country. And one way in which we're going to be different is we're never going to have a permanent class of hired farm workers. The only hired workers we were going to have, apart from slaves and stuff, were people who would learn to farm and become a farmer themselves. That's called the ag ladder. You start as a worker and you go up. And during the 1930s, that theory prevailed. During the 1930s, people said, farm workers are not like factory workers. And therefore, we should not cover them by minimum wage laws. We should not cover them by union laws because their interest was the same as the farmer, which is higher prices for crops. And the farm labor reformers then were really divided. Paul Taylor was the economist here. He was the one married to Dorothea Lange, the one who took the pictures. And he really believed that what you should do is do land reform in California and turn farm workers into small farmers. So he believed in the Jeffersonian thing. Ag is different. Don't pass labor laws. Carey McWilliams was the guy who wrote Factories in the Field. He basically said, no, these are factories in the field. Treat the workers like factory workers. So it was, why did we have ag exceptionalism? In part because farmers were powerful and all that sort of stuff. And Southern senators didn't want to have any kind of labor laws covering black workers. There are a lot of reasons. But one reason is the reformers were split. Now, if they had been divided, would it have been different? It's hard to know, but they weren't, and we didn't get it. All labor markets have to do three things. They've got to recruit people, they've got to remunerate or pay them, and they've got to keep them, retain them. Ag does every one of these different. On recruitment, there's no ads. Basically, it's all network hiring. And there's no test, there's no screening, and all that sort of stuff. The basic reason to mention that ag does it differently is you're often going to hear about labor shortages in agriculture, and what you don't hear about are the labor surpluses at the same time. So let me give you a stupid example. The biggest labor-intensive crop in North America for years was harvesting raisin grapes, 6 weeks around Fresno. And you probably know grapes are little sugar balls. Grapes have twice as much sugar as sugar cane. So if you want to get your teeth done, eat a lot of raisins because all you're doing is the sun is cooking out the water and you're getting a lot of sugar. So what happens with grapes, or it's usually Thompson seedless grapes, they measure the sugar, and when it gets 21, 22% sugar, then they start harvesting. And what do you do when you harvest? You cut those little bunches, you lay them on a paper tray, and the sun dries them into raisins. Now, we got 220,000 acres of raisin grapes. And a good worker is only going to do basically no more than an acre a day. So clearly, if we wait to start the harvest, get those sugar levels up, then we're going to need a whole lot of people. And so what happens is that I'm the labor contractor. And you don't know exactly when the sugar levels are going to be right. So you say, you know, Jose, bring me 100 workers on Thursday. And if I say, whoops, we're not ready on Thursday, I don't pay you to wait till Friday. So I'm Jose and I've got 50 workers. I'll say, yes, Mr. Smith, I bring you 100 workers on Thursday. But of course, I only have 50. So the incentives in the system are for the employer to ask for too many people too soon because he doesn't pay, and me as a contractor to promise more than I have because I want the job. So we always hear then, when I show up with 50, there's a labor shortage. We don't hear about the day that was waiting for work to begin. So our current system is designed to fail, basically. We have a decentralized system with the wrong incentives. That's the recruitment. Remuneration is the second. You all know that work is what you do, right? You exchange your effort, and in return you get some money. And in agriculture, we used to have a lot of piece rate wages. You got paid by how much you did. We still have some of that. But what's really changed is employers have gained, and you all know about how employers have gained power over workers who use computers because you can monitor what they're doing. Employers have gained enormous power in agriculture because if you drive through a field, you'll notice a lot of conveyor belts. So in Frank's days of picking lettuce, that was piece rate work. But today, most lettuce has a conveyor belt. Now as an employer, I'm going to pay hourly wages. Why? Because I tell the driver how fast to go, and that's how fast you have to work to keep up. And if you can't keep up, you're not going to stay with the job. So technology has allowed us to use hourly wages much more in agriculture that used to be piece rate workers. The other thing to say is, back if you saw the movie, there were a lot of women and older workers, and maybe even some children. Today, the average worker is 28, and it's a young Mexican man. There are only about 20% female workers. There are relatively few older workers. Doesn't mean there aren't any, but relatively few. If the workforce is homogeneous, if everybody's the same, then you don't really need piece rates, because the whole point of a piece rate is that I know what it's going to cost me to get the work done, regardless of whether it's fast people or slow people. Okay, retention. Well, in agriculture, we don't do much on retention. We basically say it's too hard to keep people. Our agriculture focuses much more on getting replenishment workers from abroad than trying to keep the best people year after year. Okay, the third topic is migration. You probably already heard this morning. We have about 40 million immigrants in this country, so almost the population of California. So an immigrant is somebody born in another country, plain and simple. About 17 million of those immigrants are naturalized U.S. citizens, like Schwarzenegger. He was born in Austria. He is a naturalized U.S. citizen. Among the remaining 23 million, that is, people born in other countries but are not naturalized U.S. citizens, half are unauthorized. Okay? And of the unauthorized, 60% are Mexican. Now, not everybody who's illegal or unauthorized works. There's about 11 million unauthorized, and somewhere between 7 and 8 million are in the workforce. There's a million children, some people are housewives, etc. About 1 million of the unauthorized workers are in agriculture. So agriculture is a small part of illegal migration. But within agriculture, half of the workers are illegal. That's why for agriculture, dealing with immigration is a big deal. Okay? Remember, we have a workforce of 155 million in this country. We have 13 million people unemployed. We have somewhere between 7 and 8 million unauthorized. Our unemployment increased by 8 million in the recession. So the economy would not stop if illegal, this whole business of day without Mexican stuff, the whole economy the economy functioned when we increased our unemployment by 8 million. So the entire economy would do just fine. But if I'm a strawberry grower, I'd be in trouble. Or if I am doing drywall in the construction market, I would be in trouble. Or if I've got a fancy restaurant in New York, I wouldn't have any food prep people. There are lots of individual places that would be in trouble. But for the economy as a whole, even though we have a huge number, it's a relatively, we have a big economy. So what we tried in agriculture in 1986 is we tried to legalize unauthorized farm workers. And we expected that to make big changes. IRCA failed. It failed in many, many ways, but especially failed in agriculture because it taught poor and rural Mexicans how to cheat the U.S. government. So let me give you an example. I happen to have worked in this. I was at the White House for a while and worked on immigration stuff. And we sat in a meeting. And remember, I don't know how many of you remember IRCA, but we had 2 legalization programs. One was for people who had been in the U.S. at least since January 1st of '82. And the other was for people who had done 90 days of farm work in 1985-86. And I can tell you how, I tell the students how you never know when you're going to have a policy impact. I happened to live in Davis. I was back in California, and I went running, and I was in the shower, and I got the call from the negotiators trying to finalize IRCA. And the question was, how many days did illegal workers have to work in the 18 months in 1985-86 to go in? And I was in the shower. I got called out, and the guy said, I need an answer in 30 seconds, and we got to move on. So I pulled a statistics book, looked up the average that we had then. It was 92 days, and we used 90 days. So that's how the 90 days is in the law. And that was not something I planned. It was not something we had studied. I clearly, at that time, it was between 150. The conservatives wanted to make it tough. 60, Howard Berman wanted to make it easy. And you needed something. And I was closer to Howard Berman than it was to the others. But that's how policy gets made. There have been dissertations written now showing that this was a conspiracy. I mean, it was not anything like that. But the punchline was that we wrote the law for farm workers so that once I said I picked strawberries, the burden of proof was on the government to prove that I didn't. And so we had this huge fraud. We sat in a meeting and said, how many application forms should we print? And our best guess was 400,000 people qualified. But we thought, well, so we printed 800,000 applications. We have 1.3 million applications. And 1.1 million got through, because remember, the government had to prove. Now what happened? We had about 2,000 applications from Manhattan. And I went to sit in on the hearing, because if you've been to Manhattan, they don't have a lot of agriculture. And we had a Haitian lady come in. And so they asked her, what did you do? And she had filled out the form. She said to pick strawberries. And the adjudicator asked her, well, how? We got our ladders and we climbed the strawberry trees. Now, she did not get through. But I can tell you that there were labor contractors were selling these documents. We had a huge number of people around Stockton who said they picked tomatoes for 92 days. That's what the typical person had, a one-sentence letter, one letterhead, saying, I picked tomatoes for 92 days in Stockton. If you've ever been to Stockton, the tomato picking season is about 70 days. It's not 92 days. So therefore, they couldn't have qualified. But we didn't have, the INS didn't have the evidence to know what actually went on. So we taught people how to defy the US government and get legal status, and they did. And we had a lot more people, and that, of course, supported the whole false documents industry. And so basically, IRCA and the SAW program unleashed a huge increase in unauthorized migration. So by 1995, half the workers were illegal, and so we said, so farmers said, if we ever enforce the law, we're not going to have any workers. And so the question was, what do we do? Well, the employers proposed a lot of new guest worker programs. Clinton said, no, I'm going to veto it. But in 2000, if you remember, Bush was elected here and Fox was elected in Mexico. Their big priority for both of them was a big guest worker program. And so the worker advocates said, we can't stop this anymore. So they did a deal with the growers. And so if you ever hear of ag jobs, that's what the UFW is pushing. That's what Western Growers is pushing. And basically, it's a repeat of IRCA with a couple of twists. You're going to get legal. If you're an illegal farm worker under this proposal, then you would get a probationary immigrant status. Back in the 87, 88, you got an immigrant status. Now it's probation. And you have to earn your legalization by continuing to do farm work. Okay? And if you're an employer, then you get changes in the guest worker program that make it easier. It's actually weaker than the Bracero program was. At least Braceros had to have housing, so there won't be housing under this new thing. And remember, there was a special minimum wage, the adverse effect wage rate. Well, under the ag jobs, that gets reduced. The super minimum wage gets reduced. That hasn't happened, and sometimes you hear this H-2A program. Lots of people complain about it. The thing to keep in mind when somebody says 95% of all employer applications are approved. Okay? People say it doesn't work, it's bureaucratic. 95% are approved. And let me now get to the end, so there's a few minutes for questions. There's three things that might happen with immigration and agriculture. The most likely, if you're a betting person, you bet that the status quo is going to continue. Regardless of who's elected this fall, the most likely thing is nothing will change. But the federal government is like a big supertanker in the middle of the ocean. And once it turns, it's really hard to stop. So what's the federal government doing? It's doing so-called I-9 audits, silent raids, whatever you want to call it. An I-9 audit is they come in and check all the I-9 forms that you complete when you get hired, and they tell you which workers appear to be unauthorized. They don't remove the workers, so we call it a worker circulation model. You get fired from my farm and you go over and work for somebody else, or you get fired from my restaurant and you go to another restaurant. And so I-9 audits are what the government is doing. There haven't been any workplace raids under Obama. There was one that was scheduled before and right after he got inaugurated, but there haven't been any. It's just the I-9 audits. And then state and local governments are passing these laws that say you have to participate in E-Verify, like Arizona and Alabama and those places. And so what's happening is that farmers take on more risk. What they're really doing is turning to labor contractor, not just labor contractors, anybody who's an intermediary. Because what are they? They're risk absorbers. They're people willing to absorb the risk of enforcement. And the workers either circulate, or if they're in a dairy or something, they stay pretty isolated because they don't want to be picked up by state and local police. That's the status quo. And if you're a betting person, that's probably what's going to happen. There's a bill in Congress in the House to make all employers use E-Verify. So E-Verify is a database. You give your information, and it goes off to the computer, and you know in a few seconds if Phil Martin is likely unauthorized. You're supposed to give me a few days to fix up my records, but most employers actually don't, because why should you invest in somebody, training somebody, if they probably can't work lawfully for you anyway? And that's what growers fear. They fear that if they knew at the outset that the worker was unauthorized, then they run a risk of fines if they nonetheless take that worker. That's why you often hear there can't be E-Verify or mandatory E-Verify unless there's also a new guest worker program. The third option is this comprehensive reform that the Senate debated in 2006 and 2007. It's got a lot more enforcement in it. But the big thing is it's got legalization as well. Remember, this is the earned legalization idea. If you're a betting person, you're going to bet on the status quo, because the country is just as divided on immigration probably as they are on abortion and a few other things, and it's not one where you're going to get a very rational sort of debate. So what's likely to happen in migration? Well, probably nothing. The tragedy is that I'm sure many of you are on the DHS list, but you know, the fraud that's already come out with what Obama announced on June 15th is just terrible. There's so many ads out there. We're going to get you immigration status. Remember what he did? He said, you can register to avoid deportation. You don't get a work permit unless you can also go and show financial hardship. And the amount of ads saying, you know, after all, it was a big announcement, and they did want a lot of publicity for it, but it is making advisors and consultants rich, and yet the whole process hasn't even started yet. They need 60 days before they set it up. And so my best guess is probably nothing. We will continue to have more enforcement. Remember, we're now deporting more people, mostly to Mexico, than we apprehended on the border. That was for the first time last year. We deported more people. We deported almost 400,000. We caught about 330,000 just inside the border. And that's the first time that's happened, I think, ever. Maybe in the 50s it might have happened once. And then we're probably going to get more state laws now that the Supreme Court has upheld at least some variation on attrition through enforcement. Remember, that's what Arizona's idea was. Its first thing that was upheld by the Supreme Court was to require all employers to use E-Verify. And then the second thing that was upheld was that if you're stopped by the police for a valid reason other than profiling, and the police think that you might be unauthorized, then they have to determine your status before they let you go. That part was upheld by the Supreme Court, although they said, if this results in racial profiling, we'll revisit it. And what that means is that there probably will be more states that do it. I thought I was done, but let me do one last thing. Just go to the bottom one here. We have about 485 cities in California. 25 of them have a lower per capita income than Mexico. Okay, so I'll say it again. 25 of the cities in California have a lower per capita. We usually pick Parlier, and it's about 20 miles or 25 miles south of Fresno. They call themselves the Bucco of the Raisin Belt because that's where the heart of raisin country. And you can see this, a little under 15,000 people. It's almost all Hispanic. 2/3 of the adults didn't complete high school, et cetera. And its per capita income in 2009, according to the census, was around a little over $10,000 a year. The per capita income of Mexico is about $10,000 a year. It's $14,000 a year in Mexico if you measure it at purchasing power parity. A dollar goes further in Mexico than it does here. Now, you sort of say, why did the people come? Well, keep in mind, if they had stayed in Mexico, they would not have earned $10,000. The people in Parlier are not from Mexico City or Monterrey or Guadalajara. They're from rural areas and they're from southern Mexico. So they're people who are coming are perfectly rational. They're coming because they make more money here. And so that makes eminent sense. But we are getting a lot of these farm worker cities. Oh, and I usually end it. You know, we have this great debate about what we do. You can have the same magazine in the same year saying, give amnesty and build a fence. And the thing we usually use, this is the official highway sign as you're going into Mexico. And what's it telling you? It's telling you, well, be careful because there are people trying to sneak across. They don't so much anymore, but they did back in the 90s especially. And this sign gets used a lot in rallies. So on the one hand, people take the sign and they say, well, this is what America's all about. These are the people who are taking the chances to come here. But of course, then you get the other side, which is taking the same symbol and saying, here's why you should not do anything. And you know, the majority of Americans, whether you like it or not, tend to be restrictionist. In any opinion poll, you'll find 60–70% of the people saying we should reduce immigration and we should do more to stop illegal migration. Now, you know, polling, you can get whatever answer you want depending on how you phrase the question, but that's normally what happens. Okay, so that's all. And I think we have a few minutes for questions, and then we can go. Yeah?
I had a question. When you look at the Arizona law and you're saying additional, how, I mean, obviously we look at farmers, that creates a financial hardship for them. Then those then looking at less competitive, because they're going to end up paying more, higher labor rates, that kind of thing?
There hasn't been a single farmer fined in Arizona, and law went into effect in 2008. So so far, I think there have been 2, okay, not a fine. What happens is, if you knowingly hire unauthorized under the law, you lose your business license. So it's happened to a water park somewhere near Phoenix, but it was already out of business when it lost its business, so it couldn't reopen, I guess I should say. So the enforcement, there may be enforcement, but you know, when you read about Alabama and Georgia and stuff like that, you got to look at the enforcement statistics. Many political scientists will tell you that migration policy is heavily symbolic. You pass a heavy-duty law, but then, and that satisfies the restrictionist, but there often is relatively little enforcement. And that could change, it always could change, but so far, you know, sometime do a Google on how many people have lost their business licenses. I know there was at least one water park that did. I'm sure there's probably somebody else. But in general, it's the University of California probably is not hiring many unauthorized workers, but the people that do are either taking on more risk and they sort of, or they're using a layered system somehow. What else? Everyone who wants to go on break, I'm sure. Well, if you don't have any more questions.
I'm so distressed. I feel like we need to do something happy.
They need to do exercises too.
Any other questions before we do break?
Okay, well, thank you.